All right, great. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to get the webinar started even as a few more people come into the so I'm Jarrett Bastow with Issara Institute. I'm going to just be facilitating today, and then I'm joined by our Executive Director, Dr. Lisa Rende-Taylor, and Mark Taylor, our Director of Strategy and Global Partnerships. Today is part of our Issara Academy webinar series that we started last year. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are going to be recording the webinar, and then we'll be sharing that out on our website and also our YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to and just get a note, but we'll also send a note when that recording is up. So this webinar today covers a report that we just put out, Top 5 Labor Abuses in 2019-2020, a field-based analysis of worker reporting and business responses in Thailand. And it really is the culmination of investment in our data analytics over the last couple of years around our worker voice channels. So our multilingual hotline, Facebook and other social media messaging, and also the Golden Dream smartphone application designed and maintained by Issara as a worker voice platform. So when a grievance comes into those mechanisms, as well as other requests for information, that data is logged, and we're working with the person that is contacting us on their desired remediation channel. Our primary support channel for that is obviously remediation with business, but just a note that we also work really closely with the job seeker or worker for how they want to raise their issue, what support they need and what support they need in remediation. And then this analysis also covers the response to that, how the remediation went. And then a really important point that we're going to dive into that is verified by the people that we're working with. So verified by job seekers and workers, how it went, how satisfactory it was. So yeah, I'm just going to let Lisa dive into that. We're going to present some of the findings from the report, which is a short 8-page report available on our website, and we sent out. We encourage you to go through it as well. And then we're going to take some time for questions as well. So we hope we have an active dialogue. You can ask a question during that period, and you can also just send us a chat note to the group or to me individually. I'll monitor that if you want to raise any issue or ask any question. We're pretty informal, so just send us the info that you'd like to incorporate, and we'll bring it up, or we'll let you do it yourself as well. Great.
Cool. Ready to go?
Oh, you froze for a second, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. So okay. I'm ready to go if you are.
Yeah, great. Let's get started.
Awesome. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, or it's morning where I am. Good afternoon to those of you who are sort of east of me. It's great to see you all. It's great to have what looked like a pretty diverse group coming in here to focus a bit on not just what workers are reporting and the kinds of situations and risks and abuses they're experiencing, but also how is business responding to this, and how has this changed during the COVID period? As you can see here on our cover, we're basically looking at the time frame of January 2019 to December 2020. And what that basically allows us to do is look at what has been the pattern, through 2019 and in early 2020, what has been the established or ongoing pattern of, violations and abuses being reported in the ways that business responded to them. And then how did that change as COVID hit, in this case, Southeast Asia, around the March 2020 timeframe. And so what you see here, I put this cover photo, this was from a few months back, of our team members going out. This is during a time when they could go out and meet with workers in, kind of a safe and private sort of dormitory environment, to be able to talk through a bit more what had been reported to them over the weeks in this particular workplace. And it just kind of, is to highlight what Jarrett talked about earlier about the importance of, it's like you can't get information about what's happening overnight for a lot of these situations. I mean, you can't do a 3-hour visit and figure out what's going on, even if you are labor experts in a nonprofit with trust with workers. It takes time to talk with them, to visit sometimes and to be able to get a rich picture of what's going on. And, the workers do get to, in our case, verify and validate what exactly the situation is that they're experiencing. Let's see. Clicking. So just to go over the worker voice channel data a little bit, this is from 2019 and 2020, so you get a sense of like, where is this coming from? As Jared explained, our worker voice channel, so this is Southeast Asia, right? So in Southeast Asia, almost everybody has one of these. We've all had smartphones for a long time and been on them constantly for many years now. So our worker voice channels have basically evolved over the years, kind of in response to the way people use their phones. So we have a 24-hour helpline in many languages and dialects for the populations that we work with. We have, chat apps, which are very popular, Line, Viber, things like that. I think here, WhatsApp or something like that. So it's kind of like that. Facebook Messenger, and of course our app Golden Dreams. This is the traffic of our worker voice channel data over the past 2 years, ending in December 2020. What you basically see is kind of constant traffic. If you look, for example, at the dark greenish teal, you can see, the Burmese Facebook, it's pretty much the same over time. The different hotlines, everything is pretty much about the same over time, the same amount of traffic, with the exception of that light bluish bar, which is the Burmese Viber line, the chat apps. And you can see that started to decline late in 2019. It was during that time that actually there was a kind of a slowdown in former MOU recruitment from Myanmar to Thailand. And we actually got a lot of traffic in hearing from job seekers, right before they were about to migrate, their pre-departure training, and then after they got into the destination country, chatting and saying like, we just arrived and we had orientation and it was great, or it was terrible, or whatever like that. That's often done with these chat apps. And so when the MOU channel and everything started really kind of shutting down, and then of course the borders closed in early 2020 due to COVID, and there was no formal labor recruitment at all. And so that, I think, is the primary kind of explanation for why that bar has gone down. But pretty much over time, you can see that the traffic is pretty constant. So what was coming in and how did it change over time? Essentially, I think as we sort of talk about it in a bit more depth in our report, there is an increase in the proportion of exploitation-related calls, and the violations that are being reported were more serious, especially during the COVID period. If you look at the pie chart on the left, that basically breaks down the kinds of calls that we get, the categories of calls. And so the dark teal are the calls that are to report, issues about in the workplace, exploitation, abuses, different kinds of violations. But then, workers and job seekers call for other reasons as well. So you see the light teal, that's just what we call an info query. So workers will call and say, oh, I heard there's a new document I need, or can you tell me more about, a range of different questions that migrant workers often have. And then there's other categories there as well, smaller categories, coordination with our team, for example, if they want us to come visit and, where to meet them and so on. And different kind of labor recruitment fee surveys and health issues. So the data that we're going to be focusing on today is this dark teal, this 43% of calls that were reported labor, trafficking, exploitation-related issues. These calls, so we've run this hotline for many years now, even before Issara was around, we were running this hotline. And typically, we're usually around 35% of calls from workers and job seekers are specifically reporting a problem. And so, the increase up to 43% was something that we found as being pretty remarkable. In addition to that, of those calls, when issues come in, we have to grade them on their severity. For case management purposes, you react and have to respond to different kind of issues and different severity of issues with different timeframes and different protocols. And so what you see on the right, we grade our cases or the issues according to 4 categories. Level 1 is, not severe, asking for information. Level 2 is, where these are, they're labor violations, but they're not violations of law. They could be violations of code of conduct. They're maybe just say the less serious issues. Level 3 issues are serious issues. They are often violations of law, or if according to the national context, they are not violations of the law, they are issues that we would still consider quite serious, like discrimination issues and so on. And then there's also level 4 issues, which are a very small proportion of what we ordinarily would see, which are basically threat to life situations where you have to respond immediately. So of all of these calls and cases that came in, we're going to be focusing on the ones that were about, labor trafficking, labor exploitation, different kinds of abuses in recruitment and in the workplace. And those calls, when they come in, there's a lot of attributes that are collected when they're logged in our system. And so this is, one of the things that we're doing here is we're basically, so we're a nonprofit, right? And we're trying to create as much knowledge and public goods as possible from this very sort of unique kind of being tapped into worker voice as we are. And so I don't know if Walmart Foundation is there. Walmart Foundation has supported us for years, specifically in doing things that are very sort of unsexy, like data systems, but they're really important because, we now have a data system that we're just now able to start putting out reports like the one that we're doing here. And there's going to be much more coming, we hope in the near future, because the data that's recorded every time there's a call that comes in from a worker, we have all the attributes from the caller. So, their nationality, their ethnicity, gender, age, home province, how they migrated, and then detailed attributes about their work. Who is their employer? Who is their recruiter? What industry do they work in? What's their destination province? And then what is the violation? We have 77 coded violations, which we call KPIs. We refer to them as KPIs because they basically are an assessment of the performance of the employer, if you look at it that way, as we work a lot with businesses and management of issues in their supply chains. And then so within these labor violations, those have attributes as well. What is the severity of the issue? When was the issue reported or opened? When was the issue closed? Maybe it was resolved well, maybe it was resolved poorly. The quality of the resolution, which is graded on a scale of 1 to 4. And so all of this data is what we are just starting to kind of tap into, and we're really excited to start pushing it out because there's just a lot of good advocacy folks and other folks within industry focused players and partners and so on that we hope will find this information useful. So for example, what we're going to be talking about today, the top 5 labor abuses according to these 2 periods of time, this comparative analysis, is basically just looking at all the KPIs and just, kind of looking at a rank order of which ones occur at the greatest frequency. We're not even in this report getting into how long did it take, to resolve each of these issues. Do the severity of issues vary by nationality? Do they vary by gender? How can you benchmark the different industries in terms of what are the most serious issues that they face and how well are they responding to it? All of these things are kind of what we hope to be able to sort of put out there in the coming weeks and months. So what do we find? We basically looked at, as I said, the top labor abuses that were reported within this time frame, and we divided the time frame into 2. The pre-COVID time frame is basically according to when COVID really hit Southeast Asia, and specifically Thailand, which was in March 2020. And up until that point, there was actually a webinar last year where that Mark had already presented and was talking about up until that point, what were the top 5 violations. And you see them listed here. We've got issues with pay, wages, and deductions. That's the top. This comes up all the time. Number 2 is misconduct or deception by recruitment agency or employer in the recruitment process. Number 3, unfair dismissals. Number 4, document retention. Number 5, issues with annual leave or sick leave benefits. So how did this change during COVID? During COVID, the top one, which we're going to delve into all of these in the purple box, in the coming slides. The first one is still issues with pay, wages, and deductions. The second was issues with workloads and breaks related to workforce reductions in the workplace. Number 3, as we've seen before, issues with annual leave or sick leave benefits, but this kind of went up in frequency of being reported by workers. Number 4 was mistreatment and abuse by line supervisors and management. And number 5, appearing again, is unfair dismissals. Are there any questions up until this point about the definitions of any of this or how we come to this point? Okay. So again, I'm going to focus on the issues that were in the purple box because we already had a webinar and some reporting in the first box. What are the three issues that were prevalent both pre and post COVID? Let's go through them one by one. The first is this issue with pay, wages, and deductions. Basically, blatant violations of national law. This is like, what workers are paid. These are in the US, we refer to a lot as like wage and hour issues. The blatant violations of national law are generally responded to by business more effectively than issues that were not illegal, but were or should be considered serious from a corporate responsibility standpoint. So for example, unreasonable targets, which really makes life quite stressful for workers, or coercive incentive systems. During COVID, so those things are like, they're signs of overwork, right? Unreasonable targets, really kind of pushing workers to work more and more, coercive incentives. During COVID, there was this other sort of new issue that cropped up, which is illegally low remuneration when hours were cut back due to reduced orders. And so when you have foreign migrant workers coming through formal channels to work in workplaces, they sign contracts, right? Of course, proper contracts, which are basically reviewed and approved by the government. And they say things like, this person is agreeing to go overseas to work and they are going to be paid at minimum 6 days a week, X baht per day or per month or whatever. And that is what they are making their decision based on, that they're going to get paid at least this minimum and they're going to get this amount of work. For OT bonuses, that should all be kind of laid out in the contract as well. But so the problem is when some of the global brands and retailers were starting to cut or reduce their orders, not pay for their orders completely or whatever, what basically happened were hours were being cut back because there was just less demand, right? But hours were being cut back very severely, but workers were only getting paid for the hours that they were being asked to work, which is actually kind of a violation of the bilateral MOU. You can't bring someone from a foreign country and say, we're going to give you this amount as the minimum, and we're going to give you this amount of work, and then basically give them half the amount of work and say, sorry, this is all you get. That's a big no-no. One of the kind of interesting sort of observations, Mark, I don't know if you're there, you can talk about this a little bit more, or maybe you were sort of chasing a child, which I just saw kind of run across my screen. But global brands and retailers, I think we saw this pattern of, during the COVID time, generally demonstrating more concern about overtaxing their stressed suppliers, not wanting to put too much stress on suppliers at this particular time, maybe having some sense about, what the supplier was going through in terms of reduced orders, or, their customers making payments and things like that, facing serious financial challenges as a result of the pandemic, and maybe less concern about the fact that these foreign migrant workers were facing the exact same thing, and in a much more precarious situation. I think a lot of my colleagues or our staff in Issara would say. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit more about this, since you're the one who talks mostly with global brands and retailers?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. I think you summed it up pretty well. The reality is, we all know is that many businesses have been extremely hit hard, by the COVID-19 pandemic, by the loss of orders, their financial health, their cash flow position, their situation was, it basically brought about, I think, a lot of stressors and underpins, I think, the challenge that a lot of the suppliers were facing. So when, some of the global brands and retailers, obviously there's a wide range of different types of supplier base, some more strategic, more heavily invested suppliers, other less so as well. And I think it sort of just underscored, I think, the reality that, you want to try to balance a situation where you're being fair, that the law is being upheld, but there's also some understanding that there's real jeopardy in some cases of some businesses going out of business, or really, how do you handle a situation like this, which is quite novel, that hasn't really happened in such a wide scale, and how to make sure that there are worker safeguards in this whole process, and what is sort of fair and reasonable expectation to try to keep employment, but balance that, against these other different directions. And so we saw examples of some really great, practices, strong communications from buyers about what their expectations were, about actions that business, that they themselves were taking in terms of making sure that orders and workers, continued to get paid during that process. And then there's also stories out there as well where this didn't happen, and it really left the suppliers in quite difficult straits. So, I think that's just the reality that's still playing out to some extent as well, and that many brands and retailers were faced against. And then there's been some really good communications out there, other partners, FLA, others, about how to recommendations, for global brands and retailers in terms of treatment and position about how to handle this for their supplier base.
That's great. And so just to kind of like look at the piece of the report where, just to kind of pull out the grading that we had, this sort of brings up some of what Mark just raised too. So this is, if you look in the report, how the different breakdowns of the KPIs, how business responses fared both pre-COVID and post-COVID. So if you look at the two, so for very later missing payments, that's a big component of the issues with pay, wages, and deductions that we see. Very later missing payments is taken pretty seriously and has been both before and after COVID, which is good because that can really make or break the life of a migrant worker. Illegal excessive deductions actually was dealt with a little bit better during the COVID period, which that's great to see. The other issues, though, did not, generally kind of were sort of floating in the below average zone, both before and after COVID. So different kinds of issues with, I guess you could say the lighter kind of, violations that are related to pay, wages, and deductions, not having the right timesheets or pay slips, issues with targets or bonuses. These are basically things that are actually have quite severe implications in the life of a foreign migrant worker, but they're not necessarily against the law. So the supplier, has a lot more wiggle room to say, well, these are our practices, this is how we manage our production or whatever. But there's a lot of ways, that you can kind of deconstruct to say, well, is this coercive or not? Is this reasonable or not? And so that just makes these issues a bit more difficult to grapple with, not just when, we are sort of working with suppliers and we're supporting workers to talk with their employers, but also when working with global brands and retailers, who is to say what is, reasonable in terms of, for example, how much shrimp should you be expected to peel per hour? Actually, for those of you who are in seafood industry, you know that there probably are established standards of what you can expect. And any particular factory would have had whatever their expectations were a year ago or 2 years ago. And so you can actually track how are those, targets and bonuses, incentives like changing over time during COVID. So this is something that we feel like you can sort of put a finger on pretty clearly, but sometimes it's been hard to get the global brands and retailers to come, behind the workers more definitively around when it's not a clear violation of national law. Second issue is unfair dismissals. So unfair dismissals really has been a challenge that we have dealt with before and after COVID. I think the thing that we sort of suspect is that it's an issue that our global brand and retailer partners aren't used to dealing with much, because if they're mainly working within like an audit compliance framework where all around the world, they're really reliant on audits to pick up different kinds of labor violations or whatever. An unfair dismissal is basically, somebody got mistreated or there was some sort of exchange or lack of understanding or lack of compliance with the contract or something which led to someone leaving. It's just not the kind of issue that it seems to be detectable or coming up in conversations or whatever with the business partners that we work with, whether employers or global brands and retailers. But when you are working with workers, it's a serious issue. And it's one that's not surprising as such a serious issue because the national laws in Southeast Asia allow for the cost of labor recruitment to be charged to workers. So that means like, if you're going to recruit more workers, who's going to pay? You can put it on the backs of the workers unless there's stronger, recommendations or requirements on the part of, the customers. And so you can get these debt bonded workers. And if there's any reason why, there is some, the employer isn't getting what they want from that worker, they can just get rid of them and get the next one with very low replacement costs. So there's a lot of reasons why we can talk about what are the problems with, labor recruitment costs being charged to workers. And it's connected to all of these different things. Unfair dismissal. I mean, think about how difficult that is. If you are a worker in a foreign country, you had all these hopes and dreams, you signed a contract, and then you're basically kind of stuck in a foreign country because you were unfairly dismissed. We see workers often dismissed for refusing to perform work that was different from their contract. So, workers that are basically recruited, and then the employer says, oh, now that you're here, actually, could you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that? And the workers say, well, my contract says, the government made you specify my job and I agreed to it. And now I'm here, I'm supposed to do this. You can't ask me to do that. And we do a lot of work to kind of build up workers in understanding what are the terms and conditions of their contract and how can they support each other in talking, with employers about their understanding of what their job really is. But workers are often dismissed for refusing to perform work that was different from their contract, for, refusing to be like shifted around from place to place because that's to the benefit of the employee or the employer, which also is kind of a violation of the bilateral MOU agreement. And sometimes we still, of course, see HR staff receiving kickbacks from churn. So every time workers are recruited, the recruitment agencies, they say, oh, if you take workers from me, I'll, give you a little bit for taking my business or whatever. And so all of these things basically are incentivizing churn, right? Improper job cancellation letters were a huge issue during the COVID time. Again, wonder, Mark, since you're the one who's working directly with businesses on this, if you want to talk a bit about the improper job cancellation letters.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, I think you touched upon a lot of the underpinnings of why there may have been reasons for workers to leave. In addition, also sometimes it's just not a good fit as well. For whatever, there's a lot of reasons why a worker may end up in a situation where they're having to leave their employer. One of the main points I want to touch upon, I think, just for the job cancellation letters, and Issara had come out with an issues brief specifically about this topic because we were seeing it so much, and also because we thought it'd be quite helpful to make sure that different suppliers, different businesses were aware of the implications when workers leave the business. And basically, the employer then has to sign or provide to the local labor department basically a letter that shows that this worker is no longer employed at their facility, their factory, at that processing facility. The challenge is, and what we really were trying to underscore with management, is that the description for the reason for departure is really critical for those foreign migrant workers. The Thailand government lists a number of different predefined statements about why workers, the reason for leaving, although they also then opened up some additional language that relates to COVID-19. And the reason why that selection, that which language is put down on these forms, is so important is that there's only one, I think, of the 4 or 5 different options that will still allow the worker to find other employment within the country. If the other language is used, then basically that worker has to go back to Myanmar or to Cambodia or to the origin country. And so obviously during a COVID environment where those borders are closed, where it's very difficult to find other employment, the existing vulnerabilities that are typically there are just amplified so much more because of this environment. And so we're really encouraging, those management of those different facilities when workers are leaving, to try to enable them to be able to find other employment opportunities. And not that it's necessarily a reflection in the discussions about risk and what do I put down on this form, but that the government has allowed, I think, a channel for those workers, especially in this environment, to basically find other employment. But that basically gets blocked unless the correct language is used on the form. So this was I think just an important point to highlight, a small detail but critical one for the livelihoods and the vulnerability of workers.
Totally. I mean, I think that, as Mark was saying, because of the COVID situation, when these letters were issued, basically workers unfairly dismissed, given a letter that basically did not allow them to get another job, but they couldn't go home. They were stranded in a foreign country with no means of work. It was an intervention that when we were going to global brands and retailers, we really saying, it doesn't really cost much, or it's not a big cost for a business to respond in a different way. So please, could you work with your suppliers to understand how it really makes a difference in the worker's life to handle job cancellation letters better in this way, and maybe have some better, greater scrutiny and ask more questions about what is going on with these dismissals as well. Because oftentimes it's basically workers who are being asked to work beyond what is fair. And then there's the obviously inherent power differential between workers and employers that can lead to these situations. Let's see. So here's what it is in the report. You can refer to the report. Basically, you can see pre-COVID, post-COVID, we see these issues. We're sort of floating in the poor below average zone, both before and after COVID. And so this, again, is an area that we would love to see a lot more. So we're not like big advocacy folks, for example, and we are just sort of like one in many in a community. It would be really great to see a bit more kind of solidarity in focusing on, the issue of unfair dismissals, because it really leaves workers in desperate situations, and it oftentimes is has its roots in a very kind of unfair situation. Third, issues with annual leave and sick leave benefits. If you've been on some of our webinars before, or if you're one of our strategic partners, you've probably heard quite a bit about how well Thai law covers the rights to annual leave and sick leave of workers, both Thai and non-Thai, but how these are commonly cheated. And this has happened before and after COVID. So the main point here is that this happened before COVID, this happened after COVID. So for example, in Thailand, if you need to take sick leave, you basically by law are not required to present a medical certificate unless you're absent for 3 consecutive days in a row. And then you have to have some sort of proof from a doctor that shows you were legitimately sick. But if not, the law says you do not have to produce this. I think that this is one of the most common scenarios that we saw or that we've been seeing for years, basically, where employers are basically saying, even if you're sick one day, if you don't give us a medical certificate, we're just going to just not pay you. Or if you really want to get paid, we're going to dock your annual leave. It's these kinds of things that are really basically against the law. So it's against the law. Is it forced labor? Is it, involuntary? These kind of very serious matters, which we also deal with. No, it's not, but these are important, when you're talking about, respecting labor rights and respecting the law. We would advocate that, respecting the Basic Labor Protection Act would be something that we all should sort of universally stand firm on. What we found is that global brands and retailers typically demonstrated a bit more willingness to call for policy and systems changes to address these risks and abuses. So, when we would talk to our partners and say, hey, can you kind of help us in talking to the supplier and reinforcing that it's important that you can't just dock people's annual leave or give them, leave without pay and not pay them at all when they legitimately were following the law. They were sick and they were, sick for this period of time, and they should have just been paid. We saw a bit more to talk about, like, well, is there a policy in place? Well, maybe they should just like communicate to workers again what the procedures are, and a lot less pushing for actual remediation and the payback of annual leave or those kind of lost wages to affected workers. This is something, again, that, when we work in this field of, is it modern slavery? Is it labor rights? Is it, everything in it, in between? I think that we sort of would really kind of argue that if we can't push for basic, respect for the law and upholding national laws, that is in the code of conduct and the standards for suppliers for most, global brands and retailers. And so this is an issue that should be considered within that. So pre-COVID and post-COVID, basically similar to the last one, kind of floating in the poor and below average zone with regards to the response of business to these kinds of issue. So, employers trying to pay back as little as possible for as much work as possible. These are, lack of understanding about how Thai law, is with regard to sick leave, these kinds of issues, employers refusing to pay sick leave benefits. We're just not seeing, as good of a response as we see with other kinds of violations. And it's really concerning because this is really kind of basic in the law. what are two issues that were emerging post-COVID? Maybe emerging isn't the right word, actually. These are issues that sort of, kind of happened, but during COVID, it became, these much bigger issues. First one, and this really was kind of a COVID-specific one, issues with workloads and breaks related to workforce reductions. So basically, in a lot of workplaces, in order to cut costs, a lot of workers were let go. There was, it's not just unfair dismissals, but basically there were a lot of workforce reductions because a lot of suppliers, appeared to be or were communicating being in a position where they just were not, getting the orders or having the orders paid that they had in the past. They had a workforce that was basically larger than what they could handle. And so there was workforce reductions. But what that meant for the remaining workforce is that there were issues of overwork, basically. And so these cost-cutting measures led to overwork for the remaining workers that were within these factories. And we did see this across industries. So this is kind of a serious issue. So what this, led to were issues of forced overtime. Forced overtime is pretty serious, heavy workloads, increases in coercive incentives to compel faster work toward higher production from a reduced workforce, and reductions in lunches and bathroom breaks. And we got quite a lot of reports of this in the last half of 2020. And we just sort of want to be clear here that these abuses lead to really serious financial consequences to workers who are already also struggling, with COVID, just like us and just like everybody else, and just like business, as well as negative consequences to physical and mental well-being. I think, with this group, we don't need to talk about all the different, layers of harm of basically kind of forced and involuntary overtime, forced overwork. You think you're going to work 8 hours, instead you're working like, 13 and a half hours, heavy workloads, and just the environment of these coercive incentives to try to drive more and more and faster work to kind of hit, unrealistic targets is really not what we all want to see in our supply chains. And this is kind of how we sort of laid it out in the report. So, involuntary forced overtime, obviously that is, directly related to forced labor. The responses to that were generally very good. When we brought in global brands and retailers to kind of help us work with the supplier to support the workers who are raising these issues, it was dealt with in a pretty prompt manner. Everything else from that, issues with regular hours, shift issues, overwork, these are things that actually, I think, there are a lot of global brands and retailers that are used to really kind of working on shift hours, not too much overtime per week and so on. Any business that's kind of been following the ETI-based code is well practiced in talking about these kinds of things, and their suppliers, I think, should be familiar with it as well. Other issues which were a bit more novel, with the COVID environment, I think were responded to a bit more poorly. So this is like the heavy workloads due to all of these workforce reductions, and then breaks just being cut just to kind of have people work on the line more. It was just, these are the kinds of issues that I think everybody maybe just wasn't used to sort of having a very clear response to. Are there any questions on any of this so far? Jared, are we good with the chat box and all that? I cannot see it from where I'm at.
Yeah, so Natalie from Ocean Mind had a really good point that we meant to bring up, which is just the kind of breakdown of these by sector and other disaggregation that we might be looking, or even benchmarking, like what are we thinking and able to provide at this point on those?
Yeah, so I mean, as I kind of mentioned earlier, this data is possible to do benchmarking. This exact same analysis you could, in addition to disaggregating by time period and doing comparative analysis that way, you could easily do that by industry with the way that we have the data structured. You could easily do that by, the nationality of worker or anything else. We can compare different employers, and this is actually something that we're going to do. We're going to put on dashboards that our partners can see. I mean, I can't produce that right now. It takes hours to analyze this kind of thing and put out reports, but that's exactly what's in mind. And I'm glad, Natalie, that you raised that, because I mean, we don't want to just put out, all kinds of random and cool nerdy stuff that we could do. We want to put out stuff that you guys could really utilize and would find to be kind of important and helpful in your work. And so this sort of back and forth between us saying, hey, it would be really great if you could do X, Y, Z, whatever. And then, we could sort of start pushing this stuff out. I mean, that's exactly kind of what we're hoping to do, as a nonprofit that really kind of aspires to put out more good public goods. So yeah, but definitely the industry benchmarking, and we talk with a lot of seafood friends as well, and I think that we can kind of see we have this general conversation about how is the response in seafood compared to, say, like electronics or apparel and footwear, and the short answer is like considerably markedly worse. And we want to be able to put out more objective evidence on that and have you guys help to carry that conversation forward, because there's just so many other things that you guys do that we all together are kind of complementary. So yeah, if you want to share more specific stuff now, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. It would be really interesting to pull apart some of those data sets, and maybe we could have a conversation later on to talk about how we could pull those apart and what would be most useful, because something we've observed in and this isn't necessarily for domestic fisheries, but sort of the overseas fleets is that they've been, during the COVID era, they've been less able to call into ports, which has meant trip lengths are a lot longer, they've had less human contact, and the transshipments are less regulated because they're not happening inside ports. So it'd be really interesting to see if there's any sort of worker voice data around some of those implications as well.
That'd be great. Definitely, then let's connect on that. And for you guys and any other sort of seafood folks, I know you guys are really, focused on fisheries, but for seafood, I had to say, it's not time to stop focusing on what's happening on shore as well. The situations that are happening, that are occurring in tuna canning, seafood processing, and those kinds of things on shore still need to be focused on. There are still issues within these, and the way that these businesses respond compared to, again, electronics, apparel, footwear, it is something that we all need to be able to keep on the table, that there needs to be a focus on what's happening on fishing vessels, commercial kind of like within tide waters or whatever, and distant water fleet, but then also what's on shore. So I think that would be, the more evidence that we can give that makes that useful to you guys, the better.
Totally. It would be fascinating just to dive into some of the different areas just within the seafood industry as well, because obviously the worker voice element on board fishing vessels, the results from that are likely to be quite different to, say, the factory workers for the shrimp farmers, the peelers, the packers, or again for electronics and apparel, there would be different as well. So great, looking forward to that. Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, sure.
And Lisa, I was gonna jump in to say it's probably worth highlighting that in terms of public product, we're also engaging in some academic partnerships, which obviously take longer for the results to come to fruition, much longer. But particularly one with MIT that we're looking at a lot of this data and then looking at other research possibilities. So that benefit from this data analytics investment really is to be shown with that type of academic work tied in as well. In addition to what obviously our work is robust, but also these partnerships will look at it from many different angles and many different disaggregations as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that. Like, I think it's nice that it's taken years to pull this together, to have the system, but now we realize that this is data that it is like literally sitting on a gold mine. So, for all of us to be able to kind of come together and make the most out of it, that's kind of what it's all about when you're sort of a nonprofit. It's super exciting. Okay, let me just cover this last one. So the second emerging issue post-COVID was mistreatment and abuse by line supervisors and/or management. So this happens all the time, but it's just that this really kind of got elevated in terms of frequency, during the COVID period. And I think it was just sort of exacerbated by the fact that there's closed national borders, workers really had nowhere to go. It's just like a really difficult time, as you can imagine, for foreign workers, in a foreign country. So we found that employers responded most promptly to issues of physical abuse or other persistent degrading abuse. Also discrimination, which we usually see in the form of discrimination by gender, nationality, and ethnicity. And I think that, there's no surprise that these are issues that global brands and retailers tend to take seriously. And so that kind of translates to the seriousness with which their suppliers would, work with us on these issues. The less severe but equally persistent verbal abuse, and it's kind of like verbal mental abuse, the things that people say, especially against different nationalities or genders or ethnicities, and overall suppression of worker voice was a bit more poorly and inconsistently responded to by business. Some businesses have a very clear, it's actually not as common as we like, have a very clear position about against suppression of worker voice, but a lot don't. And there's this kind of concept in many businesses that, well, if workers have an issue, they should take it to their own grievance mechanism. Don't take it to some NGO. Why are you reporting on your issues in our factory to some NGO? And I think that there needs to be a bit more consideration of the fact of, well, maybe it's because they speak a foreign language and they're having a problem with their interpreter. Or maybe they're having a problem with, someone in HR who is like harassing them or extorted them or something like that. And, to ask them to go to the very same person or unit it's a big ask. It's requiring a lot of trust, and, it often kind of goes sideways. For us, we always, it's like a part of our practice, encourage workers individually or even better collectively to, analyze the issue that they're facing. We do a lot on empowerment and education about, workers' rights, and say, you guys take it to the employer, have a conversation, demand that they respect what you had to say, and that, have them respond to you, not have to have an NGO intervene all the time. Although, we're kind of there to help safeguard and so on. And it's just really super early times in Southeast Asia for this, and the power asymmetries and the risks that do need to be like legitimately safeguarded against are just they're real. They're real in Southeast Asia. And so this is kind of why I think, all of us doing this together, it's still really important for this environment.
Lisa, if I could.
Yeah, sure.
If you don't mind, if I just jump in with an additional point here,
Yeah.
because this really does get to the heart, I think, of a lot of the work that Issara does, in running a helpline and the model that we have both with suppliers and with the global buyers as well, and looking to have responsible supply chains. When it comes to the conversations that we are having for remediation and when raising issues, one of the big components, yes, of course, we want to see justice, we want to see the correct action taken, for those individual workers. But a lot of it also is trying to get at the root cause issues and try to, uncover what systems change may be needed. And one of the big areas that we're really focusing on here is also, how well functioning is the internal grievance mechanism of the business. And so one of the areas with all this information coming in is the intent, and kind of, the next steps that follow is to be sharing some of this information in aggregated ways, with the supplier as well, to try to have them better understand, why is it that workers in the first place are coming to Issara rather than using their own channels, and what steps can be done differently. Ultimately, that's, as a nonprofit and wanting to, have impact on the ground and help as many workers, but help business at the same time. A big part of that is being able to have an exit strategy for us as well in the process, right? We're still always there, but how can we have stronger grievance mechanisms built in place, so that the role of organizations like ourselves can be focused on other different areas as well. And so that's a big part of this data and this analysis, is also to help those suppliers, and therefore the buyers too, who are sourcing from them, to really understand, where are the different intervention points and what can we do so you don't get caught in an endless cycle of just addressing repeated issues, but we're really understanding, what are the trends, what works well, and what may take other steps. Thanks.
Well, Mark, maybe that's a good segue to go into, just because I'm seeing that we're 9 minutes out and we want to be able to have more Q&A. Did you want to go right into what are we going to do with this? And then what do we have as recommendations for others?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I guess that's part of it right there. I guess we want to really communicate that, how we're actively utilizing this information. Issara is committed basically to take the information that we have, and act upon it, based on what workers are really saying. And so we're also putting this out there with the hopes that, others will be using this information as well. And so, in terms of the work that we're doing on the ground, obviously, that's the engagement with both those suppliers as well as the global brands and retailers and importers that we're working with. It's integrating this information, across the breadth of different stakeholders too that we're engaging. I think in the area of recruitment, for example, that's one that has so many different actors, both in source and destination side. Starting off with CSOs that we're collaborating with, to the government whose systems we're trying to improve and strengthen, to the recruitment agencies, to the employers, the suppliers, and to the brands who, those that are trying to employ, more ethical recruitment practices. All this sort of feeds in as well. Training materials. So, in addition to different webinars, we have Issara Academy as well too, that's helping to go ahead and I think get more information out based on this kind of information, and also to hear the voices of others and identifying what more good practice looks like in different ways to tackle this. Because it's not just about, a big part of this is an awareness of the different issues that arise. But then it's also what are those pragmatic tools and next steps and solutions and, that support and capacity building to try to also put those tools in the hands of duty bearers. And so that's the big part of the multi-stakeholder work that we're also doing. Going forward a little bit more, in our focus on 2021 with our strategic partners program, we're also recognizing that there's a lot more work that we would like to be doing and we think could be much more impactful. Really taking a stronger look at what are the different policies and procedures and how's that being communicated with each of the suppliers that the brands and retailers are sourcing from. So I think we've uncovered and seen how important it is not just to have a policy, but also to see how that's being communicated and reinforced and understood, not only between the buyers and the suppliers, but even within those suppliers' own workplace as well too. So that's another important feedback, an area we're going to be focusing on. Then I'd say lastly, in terms of some of our key actions, and that's I think what got brought up from Natalie and others here is really trying to look a bit more about the cross-sectoral analysis, benchmarking as well. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that will be coming up in the upcoming year where we can really sort of be understanding and give greater clarity and visibility about, what are the different areas around, for instance, the timeliness to reform, the quality of those reforms, and the openness that the business has to some of these behavior change elements we're looking towards. And of course, then just putting out more evidence-based and analytics. For global brands and retailers, then, there's, I think, a number of different steps and around this. And I recognize we're a little bit short on time. These are all outlined.
It's in the report.
It's in the report. So maybe I'll just leave it here and just have people reference it just so we still have time for a few Q&A, if that's okay. Unless, Lisa, there's a couple points that you wanted to point out in particular.
No, I mean, it really is in the report. And, for the kind of recommendations of global brands and retailers, it would be good if we all sort of landed together on having the same kind of, conversations with global brands and retailers that is based on what workers are saying, which actually, I guess, which leads to the recommendation to advocates and programmers. Our recommendation is to align advocacy and programming with, all of these points above and basically to start aligning with an emerging evidence base that comes from worker voice more generally. This second point, this is something that there's conversation that's been going on with this for a long time, but, we're trying to figure out how to kind of make it stick a bit more. Audit compliant certification schemes seem to be able to achieve a lot of things like outside of labor. They are not effective at all. And there's been a lot of recent documentation evidence of this as applied to addressing labor and social risks. And so we advocate for having safe, credible worker verification of labor risks and abuses, and worker verification of how suppliers and recruiters respond, being more integrated into what we're basing our advocacy and our programming on. And so, who gets to say what's happening for labor conditions? Is it just, if an audit pops up and then the supplier says, I can confirm that I addressed this and here is my evidence, and no one, tries to get any verification from a worker of whether that's the case? Like, that is essentially the system in a nutshell as it is. And that's obviously highly problematic. And that is, one of the root explanations of how you could have, so much audit compliance going, in the social space. But yet, every year there will be a very kind of, large and rich, journalistic investigation of some very kind of serious and real labor abuses. How come these things continue to be persisting when, there's audit compliance that's going on all the time? This is the reason, right? And I think that this has been talked about a lot. So donors can help make all this possible. I think that the main points here is that effective advocacy and sustained action, whether it's by business or, by the folks that work with government, like in the UN, or like a lot of other, nonprofits and groups like we have here, it requires evidence that is, of course, ethical. That's our hope, right? That's our aspiration. That's our standard. And worker driven and being generated on an ongoing basis. What does this mean? This means that, it's not enough for us to be kind of, waiting for that next, big report that came out in X country that cost the organization, $200,000 to do and like 18 months of their time. All of those kinds of things are useful, but we can't build a sectoral response, like a community response, a response to modern slavery based on that. I think one of the points that I mentioned here, like in point 3, like this is just like any other development sector. If you're talking about maternal child health, HIV/AIDS, so I come from a career working in international development. Most of my time was based in Southeast Asia, same as Mark, same as Jarrett. And when you work on issues of like, trafficking, labor, modern slavery, whatever you want to call it, it's a development sector. Just like if you're working on maternal child health, HIV/AIDS, economic empowerment, these are rich areas of work that require, years of programming at many different levels that is constantly being fed, not just by analyses and research, but by analytics. I mean, when you think about like, the HIV/AIDS response in Southeast Asia or Africa or whatever, it wasn't just, a big report coming out every 2 years from this country and this country, and then on that you can base a proper response. No, there needs to be more than that. And I think that that's kind of our argument here. It's asking a lot of, the people who are working in the business and human rights space, whether you're kind of industry specific or not, to be able to do a lot without having the nature of information that other development sectors have. And so we do advocate for support to organizations aiming to build worker power and the evidence base, because this is the kind of, ongoing information that's needed for advocates, for duty bearers, for capacity builders, and to support the piloting, development, evaluation, and scale up of credible systems for worker verified, worker driven remediation and systems change. Basically, if there's going to be an audit, an alternative to social audits for business to specifically address labor and social risks, it's got to be developed, tested, invested in, scaled up. It's not something that business is going to magically do itself. That makes no sense. There is got to be, specialists involved in building out these systems that are not commercial systems. They're systems that could be used with and for business, but it is not a commercial system to figure out, like, audit compliance is essentially, is this product, good enough for me to import, export, sell, whatever, the goals of audit compliance are. It's just not really suitable for, addressing and remediating labor trafficking, modern day slavery. That's kind of our main points. I think that we have pretty much taken it to the bell. Jared, I don't know if there's any way we can take a few more questions or if there are questions out there, but I can hand it back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, we're at time, so we understand people may have to jump off. We're really happy to stay on for a bit longer and answer any questions. We do have a number of questions from Emma in the chat. This is Emma looks to be like me, asking 19 questions in one question box, but we also, if anybody else wants to ask a question on audio, please go ahead. The question from Emma is, how do we communicate this kind of data to global brands retailers and suppliers and how it's received, and then how we ensure we're getting accurate information on their follow-up analysis. So maybe we can sort of explain that accurate follow-up on their analysis during the remediation comes from workers, in addition to what suppliers and others say they are doing. So that is like at the heart of our loop, closing the loop and really considering remediation closed is when it's verified by the job seeker or worker. But also, yeah, maybe you want to go into a little bit more of how we workshop all this data at a broader level with them, or Mark as well.
Great. I can maybe just start for the first part of that answer there. You know, it's a journey that we're going on with each business. You know, we recognize that, you know, across the global brand retailer partners, you know, they're at different starting points. There are different places in terms of, you know, where they are in their policy development, but we're all generally aiming for, you know, the same type of positive outcomes, you know, for workers. And so a big part of this has, you know, about the communications piece and what the next steps are. I think the very honest reality is worker voice is new to many global brands and retailers. How they receive that information, how that information is then integrated with existing systems or new systems need to be able to be built in based on this is a big part of the conversation that we're just beginning to have. And you know, that's critical because one, it informs sourcing decisions. It informs a lot of the ways that suppliers or importers may be incentivized or disincentivized in terms of the actions that suppliers are or are not taking, you know, with regards to labor issues. There's other areas that we're working on. I mean, we want to make sure that first and foremost that, you know, that information is out there and there's visibility of risk. We want to make sure that we're not providing information just for due diligence purposes, but we're looking to be partnering in those brands and retailers that are our strategic partners are actually taking action based on the information that comes up. And then really figuring out, you know, how can we really work on supplier strengthening in a way that Issara can be a technical partner and help provide information, but Issara is not going to solve the problems for the brands and retailers that arise within their supply chains. That's a duty bearer responsibility. So that's a responsibility of government. It's a responsibility of the supplier or recruitment agency, and it's a responsibility of the buyer. And so that's sort of the dynamic that we have when we're bringing information out is, you know, one, how can we make sure that that information is getting to the right place, action is being taken, and then also, of course, what's the longer term investment so that, you know, the supplier and the systems are strengthened in the process as well. So I'll stop there. I could talk for hours on it, but make sure there's a chance for others. Thanks.
There's another question that kind of ties into, we could take like kind of at its face and also like a little bit more broadly, which is what Mark, you mentioned earlier about the temporarily filling this role to also work with suppliers on system strengthening and building internal grievance mechanisms. So how do we see ourselves, and then also more broadly, third-party grievance mechanisms that are focused on worker voice? How do we see not that exit strategy, but just that long-term vision? So I think an important point from me is that there is a lot of intensive work that's been touched upon, that's needed, touched upon today. And so really this role, at the same time, we want to push that duty back on the business to remediate and to address and to have the support and capacity to do that. And that's part of what we're there for as well, is these partnerships. But you do have anything more on that long-term vision where we would see, you know, in some partnerships, we see the third-party grievance mechanism, worker voice channels functioning really well, but with more of a light touch partnership with the business because they have developed their own system so far. But yeah, where do you guys see that? I think it's a really interesting question.
So I might just have like a quick comment, and you know, this comes from maybe a bit more of my background in human rights, but like, just say we did the same presentation next year, and just say we see that the responsive business has not improved at all to serious labor violations. Like this is kind of a reality that, like, you know, transparency can bring out. Like, you know, is business really responding better or not to workers? Are workers really actually, you know, empowered to be able to raise issues, and they are responded to with respect and with like a timely and appropriate response? You know, there's the grievance mechanism, but then there's also like the verification and tracking and transparency around like, what is business doing? Do you know what I mean? So if there is more of a community that is around like, okay, let's hear what the workers are saying about how business is doing, and then how do I sort of drill down, and who is responsible for drilling down? I think we just sort of need to move a little bit more to that world. I mean, I don't want to speak for, you know, our team in Asia, but I would guess that they probably don't want to be doing exactly what they're doing now in 5 years. Do you know what I mean? Same factories, same issues,
Yep.
same root causes being like ignored or neglected or whatever. Nobody wants that. You know, like human rights NGOs don't want that. We don't want that. And I'm guessing the global brands and retailers don't want that. So I think that this is sort of one of the, you know, this is kind of a plug for like, you know, data and solidarity around it, and, you know, analytics, not just like giant, you know, pieces of like rigorous research, but like real ongoing analytics that's based on worker voice. I really think it's important to kind of have that as a foundation to our sector really professionalizing and being able to kind of move forward.
Mark, did you have anything to add to that? It was kind of one final question or note.
No, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I would just say, you know, 2 points. So one, so some of the data was from global brands and retailers we showed today. Others is, you know, not from partners. We run a worker voice, you know, our worker voice channels, and the helpline is open to all workers. So I just sort of want to mention that. And the other is that, you know, I think, you know, just like almost any industry-led initiative, you're going to have some forerunners, you're going to have some businesses that are much more advanced and really kind of, you know, demonstrating what's possible. And then you'll have, you know, a bigger group that are, you know, interested, but maybe not be quite ready to take, you know, the lead. And then you'll have some that are just, you know, sort of a bit laggards in the process. And I think that's the reality. So when we talk about business moving forward, you know, I think there's two real parts to this. You know, one is we want to be working with those that really want to accelerate and push the envelope within their industry, and, you know, bring others along to really help, you know, address what's possible. And then there's also more work that we want to be focusing on, you know, and this is sort of outlined in our own strategy for the years ahead, is working more with industry associations and others to really kind of help, I think, galvanize and get this information out there, so it can be better acted upon as well. Because we're not going to move the needle in the way that we would all like to just with working with a few leading companies. That certainly can help, but we really want to make sure that this can become more normalized and just greater acceptance, I think, in a lot of the points that were brought up. So that would just be my only other point to add.
Great, thank you.